The number of shafts and tunnels we got, it's been here at least 300 years.
What if Silo has been lying to us about the one thing we never thought to question? Not the outside, not safeguard, not the algorithm, not even the reason humanity went underground. The timeline itself. For 3 seasons, we've been operating under the assumption that Juliet Nichols is living roughly 3 centuries after the world we see in the before times. 300 years sounds like an enormous amount of time. It creates distance. It makes Daniel Keene, Helen Drew, Per Stenson, and Senator Thurman feel like ancient history. It tells us that whatever happened to the old world happened so long ago that nobody alive inside the silos could possibly remember it. But Season 3 has quietly made that assumption much harder to accept. Because the more we learn about how the silos were designed, how information was controlled, how memories were manipulated, and how Silo 1 operates, the more obvious one possibility becomes. The 300-year timeline may not be a natural historical fact at all. It may be part of the control system. And if that's true, then the story we're watching isn't simply about people discovering what happened to their ancestors. It's about people discovering that their entire understanding of their own age, their own history, and even their place in the world has been manufactured. Think about what the residents of Silo 18 actually know about the past. The answer is almost nothing. They know there was a world before them. They know something terrible happened. They know the founders created the silo. They know the outside is dangerous. They know certain relics are forbidden. They know that asking too many questions can get you killed. But where is the independent historical record proving exactly how long they've been underground? Where are the complete records showing generation after generation? Where is the original calendar? Where is the chain of evidence that connects Juliet's world directly to Daniel's world and proves that exactly 3 centuries passed between them? There isn't one that the residents can personally verify, and that is incredibly important because Silo has already established that information doesn't naturally disappear in this society. It is deliberately removed. Books are destroyed. Relics are confiscated. Memories can be altered. Historical knowledge is restricted. The Pact determines what people are allowed to know. The algorithm identifies people who become dangerous because they ask questions. So when a civilization has spent generations destroying evidence of its own past, how can anyone inside that civilization independently verify its timeline? They can't. And that gives us the first major clue that the 300-year figure could be less reliable than we've assumed. The people inside the silos don't remember the world before the silos because they're not supposed to. They don't know who built their society because they're not supposed to. They don't know what happened during the earliest years because they're not supposed to. Their entire historical identity has been filtered through the people who control the system. And if those people wanted everyone to believe that 300 years had passed, they wouldn't need to build some impossible time machine. They would simply need to control the records, control the education, control the stories, and make sure nobody alive had enough evidence to challenge the official version. That's already happening. The question is why? Because saying the timeline is wrong isn't enough. There has to be a reason for the lie. And this is where Season 3's Before Time story becomes so important. We are finally seeing the people who created the Silo project. We are watching Daniel, Helen, Stenson, and Thurman exist in the world before the underground civilization became what Juliet knows it to be. And the entire purpose of this storyline is to show us that the silos weren't originally designed as a permanent civilization. They were designed as a contingency plan. Stenson was terrified of technological threats capable of ending humanity. Nanotechnology was one of them. The mission involving Charlotte demonstrated exactly how devastating that technology could be. And the response was so extreme that the people involved believed underground shelters were necessary to preserve humanity. The silos were meant to protect people from an extinction-level event and eventually allow humanity to continue. That's the foundation of the entire project. But here's where things get interesting. A contingency plan has an endpoint. You don't build a bunker because you expect humanity to live underground forever. You build it because you expect the danger to eventually pass. You wait. You survive. You come out. So why are the people in Juliet's time still underground hundreds of years later? That is the real mystery. Maybe the outside never recovered. Maybe the nanotechnology remained active. Maybe the original plan failed, or maybe the people controlling the silos deliberately extended the isolation long after the original emergency was over. And if that's what happened, then manipulating the timeline would be extremely useful. Because imagine you're responsible for a population that was originally supposed to stay underground for several decades. Eventually, people are going to ask when they can leave. They're going to ask whether the outside is safe. They're going to ask how long their ancestors have been waiting. They're going to want to know what happened. But now imagine telling them something different. You don't tell them they've been underground for 50 years. You tell them it's been 300. Suddenly the outside becomes psychologically unreachable. Their ancestors are no longer their grandparents, their ancient history. The world before the silo isn't a place their family remembers. It's mythology. And that's powerful because time itself becomes a wall. The physical walls of the silo keep people underground, but the belief that hundreds of years have passed keeps them from imagining that the old world could still be waiting outside. This also explains why the relics are so dangerous. We've always understood relics as pieces of forbidden technology or culture from the before times, but their real danger could be much more specific. A relic can establish a connection between the present and the past. It can prove that the old world wasn't some distant mythical civilization. It can reveal that the people who lived before the silos were ordinary human beings. They had cars, they had phones, they had music, they had photographs, they had families. And if somebody finds a relic that contains a date, a photograph, a timestamp, a news report, or any other evidence of when something happened, suddenly, the entire historical narrative can begin to collapse. That's why relics don't just represent old technology. They represent evidence, and evidence is dangerous to a system built on controlled history. Now look at the memory storyline. Season 3 has made memory increasingly important, particularly through Juliet's damaged memories, and the way the silo system has historically manipulated what people know. This is not accidental. The show is putting two concepts beside each other: memory and history. Individual memory can be erased. Collective history can be erased. Once you control both, you control a civilization's understanding of itself. And that's exactly what Silo 1 appears to do. Silo 1 isn't simply another silo. It sits above the others in the hierarchy. It possesses information the other populations don't have. It monitors the silos. It understands the algorithm. It controls systems like Safeguard. It knows more about the outside than ordinary residents do. It has the ability to communicate with and influence the other silos. If you control that much information, controlling the calendar isn't difficult. And perhaps that's why Silo 1 is so obsessed with stability. The residents aren't supposed to discover the truth too quickly. They're not supposed to communicate freely. They're not supposed to remember everything. They're not supposed to know what other silos are doing. They're not supposed to know what Safeguard actually is. And they're definitely not supposed to know what is happening on the surface, because every piece of information connects to another. Juliet learns about Silo 17. Silo 17 leads her to Safeguard. Safeguard leads to Silo 1. Silo 1 leads to the Founders. The Founders lead to Daniel and Helen. Daniel and Helen lead directly into the before times, and suddenly the past isn't mythology anymore. It's evidence. That's why the dual timeline is so important. It isn't simply there to give us background information. The show is deliberately forcing us to watch the creation of the silo system while simultaneously watching Juliet dismantle it. We're seeing the lie being created and the consequences of that lie generations later. But there's something else we should pay attention to: technology. The world of Juliet doesn't feel like a civilization that has naturally developed over 300 years. It feels like a civilization that has been artificially frozen. Think about how strange the technology is. The silos possess advanced infrastructure, surveillance systems, medical technology, automated machinery, sophisticated computing systems, and an enormous interconnected network. Yet the average resident has almost no understanding of how any of it works. That's possible if the original builders created everything and deliberately prevented later generations from understanding it. But it also creates a bizarre cultural contradiction. 300 years should produce enormous changes. Languages change. Customs change. Architecture changes. Social structures change. Religious beliefs change. Technology evolves. Even the way people tell stories changes. Yet silo society remains remarkably trapped in the same patterns. The same rules survive. The same fear of the outside survives. The same cleaning ritual survives. The same hierarchy survives. It's almost as if someone has been deliberately preventing cultural evolution. And that makes me wonder whether the silos have experienced resets, not necessarily literal resets, where everyone wakes up with no memory. Something more subtle. Every few generations, the system could remove dangerous information, destroy records, eliminate rebellious leaders, rewrite history, adjust the official timeline, maybe even manipulate which technologies are allowed to survive. That would create the illusion of continuity while preventing anyone from reconstructing the truth. And this is where the 300-year theory becomes even more disturbing. Maybe there wasn't one continuous 300-year civilization. Maybe there were several cycles, several populations, several versions of the same experiment. And the people inside Silo 18 simply believe they're the latest generation in a single uninterrupted history. Imagine discovering that the silo has done this before. A rebellion happens. The system activates safeguard. The population dies. A new population takes its place. The records are erased. The timeline is adjusted, and the survivors are told that their civilization has always existed exactly as they understand it. That would turn safeguard into something far more terrifying than a weapon. It would become a reset button. And suddenly Bernard's role becomes much more tragic. Bernard thought he was protecting Silo 18, but what if the people above him were never interested in protecting individual people? What if they were protecting the continuity of the experiment? That would explain why certain deaths are accepted so casually, why rebellions are treated as contamination, why entire populations can be sacrificed, why knowledge is more dangerous than violence. Because a person holding a weapon can be stopped. A person holding the truth can change everyone. And Juliet is exactly that kind of person. She doesn't simply resist authority. She connects evidence. That's what makes her so dangerous. She sees that the outside story doesn't make sense. She sees that the silos aren't independent. She sees that safeguard exists. She discovers Silo 17. She communicates with people who were supposed to be isolated. And now the before time story is giving her something even more dangerous. A direct connection to the people who created the system. If Juliet eventually discovers that the 300-year timeline was manipulated, then she doesn't just learn a new fact, she destroys the psychological foundation of the silo. Because once you prove the timeline is false, every other historical claim becomes questionable. If they've lied about how long we've been underground, what else have they lied about? If they've lied about the age of the civilization, how do we know the outside is still poisonous? If they've lied about the founders, how do we know their rules were ever meant to be permanent? If they've lied about safeguard, how do we know what its real purpose is? And if they've lied about all of that, then perhaps the most important question becomes, what happened between Daniel's world and Juliet's world? Because that missing period is where the real story could be hiding. We know how the silos began. We know Stenson feared nanotechnology. We know the project was designed to preserve humanity. We know the world faced catastrophic technological threats, but we still don't know exactly how the system transformed from a survival shelter into the rigid civilization Juliet inherits. That transformation could be where the 300-year lie was created. Maybe the original founders expected people to emerge. Maybe the outside became safe and they refused to let anyone know. Maybe the nanobots mutated or evolved. Maybe the silo system became controlled by an AI. Maybe Silo 1 took power. Maybe the original humans died and the people running the system now are descendants who no longer even understand the original purpose. Or maybe the most disturbing possibility is that the 300 years are real, but the timeline is still a fabrication in another way. Perhaps the silos haven't existed continuously for 300 years. Perhaps there were periods of isolation, population replacement, and deliberate resets. The number could be technically correct, while the history is completely false, and that would fit Silo perfectly. Because this show rarely lies by inventing something completely false. It lies by giving people a partial truth. The outside really is dangerous, but maybe not in the way they think. Safeguard really does protect the silo, but it can also destroy it. The founders really did build the silos, but their original intentions may not be the same as the system's current purpose. The algorithm really does maintain order, but it also suppresses information. And perhaps the 300-year timeline really does represent the approximate age of the silo civilization, but the events inside those 300 years are not what we've been told. That's an even better mystery, because then the question isn't simply, has the timeline been fabricated? It's, what happened during the missing centuries? That could be the final piece of the puzzle. Maybe there was a massive rebellion long before Juliet's. Maybe another group escaped. Maybe people reached the surface and discovered something. Maybe Silo 1 was created later. Maybe the silos were originally independent and only became connected afterward. Maybe the algorithm wasn't part of Stenson's original plan at all, and perhaps the biggest secret isn't what happened before the silos. It's what happened after they were built. That is the period we haven't really seen. Daniel's world shows us the beginning. Juliet's world shows us the result. But somewhere between those 2 points lies the transformation, and Season 4 could finally take us there. Because once Juliet begins questioning the timeline, the show has an opportunity to completely redefine what the silo actually is. It could turn out that the people inside aren't simply descendants waiting for the apocalypse to end. They could be participants in a system that has been repeatedly maintained, modified, and reset. They could be living through a cycle, and the reason Juliet is different is because she's breaking the cycle. That's why I don't believe her story ends with simply opening the door. The real victory would be discovering who closed it, when they closed it, and how many times they've convinced humanity to stay behind it. Because imagine the final reveal. Juliet reaches a hidden archive. Not another relic. Not another damaged hard drive. Not another forbidden book. A complete record. And she finds the original timeline. The real dates. The real deaths. The real rebellions. The real moments when people went outside. The real history of the silos. And then she discovers something impossible. The last major event happened much more recently than everyone believed. Maybe decades ago. Maybe generations ago. Maybe even within living memory. Suddenly, the 300-year gap collapses. Daniel's world isn't ancient. It's connected to theirs. The people who built the system aren't mythical figures from a forgotten civilization. They're the beginning of a history that has been deliberately hidden. And if that happens, then the final mystery of Silo won't be whether humanity can survive outside. It will be whether humanity can survive the truth about what happened inside, because that's what makes this theory so disturbing. The silo doesn't need to keep people underground with concrete walls alone. It needs to convince them that the world outside belongs to another age. It needs to convince them that their ancestors are long dead. It needs to convince them that the old world is unreachable. It needs to convince them that nothing exists beyond the boundaries of the story they've been given, and the number 300 does exactly that. 300 years is psychologically enormous. It's enough time to make the past feel fictional, enough time to make the founders feel like gods, enough time to make the outside feel permanently lost, enough time to make people stop asking when they can leave. But Juliet has already started doing the one thing the silo system was designed to prevent. She's comparing the evidence. And once you start comparing the evidence, the official timeline becomes just another story. The real question is no longer whether the world ended 300 years ago. The real question is who needed everyone to believe it did. And if Season 3 is building toward that revelation, then the final season could expose something far bigger than the origin of the silos. It could reveal that the people inside have been living inside a manufactured version of history. A history where time itself became another form of control. And when Juliet finally breaks that illusion, the most terrifying discovery may not be that the world outside survived. It may be that the world outside has been waiting for them this entire time.